Hi everybody, it's Dr. Mende again as we continue to discuss on the brainstem. So we had just discussed the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. Now I needed to appreciate what we call the interpeduncular fossa, and this is a region located at the brainstem, and it's usually bordered by the basal pons caudally, the crus cerebri laterally, and rostrally we have the optic chiasma and optic tract. So as you can see in this diagram, you have the basal pons caudally and the crus cerebri, which are parts of the midbrain laterally, and then rostrally we have the optic chiasma there, and optic tract at that point. So what is contained within the interpeduncular fossa? We have the mammillary bodies, where my arrow is pointing, that those are the mammillary bodies. We have the oculomotor nerve, the tuber cinereum, okay, that's a tuber cinereum, and the infundibular stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Again, that shows you the infundibular fossa. Caudally, you have the pons, basal pons. Rostrally, we have optic chiasma and optic tract, and laterally, we have the crus cerebri. So we've said it contains the infundibular stalk, tuber cinereum, the mammillary bodies, and the oculomotor nerve. You can still appreciate the posterior perforated substance at that region. So next we are going to discuss on the cerebellum. So we have finished the diencephalon that had the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. We discussed the brainstem. Now we are going to discuss the cerebellum. It's located in the posterior cranial fossa. That's the cerebellum at that region. And it's also divided phylogenetically like the basal ganglia. So this is based on evolution. So the first part of the cerebellum to develop was the archicerebellum, which is also called the vestibulocerebellum, and it's composed of the flocculonodular lobe and the fastigial nucleus. And from the word vestibulocerebellum, the main function of these parts is for balance. Evolution led to development of paleocerebellum, which is also the spinocerebellum that is composed of the anterior lobe, the vermis and the paravermis, as well as the globose and emboliform nuclei, and these execute movement. Lastly, Neocerebellum or cerebrocerebellum, composed of the posterior lobe and the dentate nuclei who are formed, and these are responsible for planning of movement. So this shows you the parts of the cerebellum. You have two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and this is the anterior lobe, okay? This is the anterior lobe. It's separated from the posterior lobe by a fissure there. So this is the posterior lobe, and this is the flocculonodular lobe. And then this is the vermis, and lateral to it is the paravermis region. So this is the vermis, the pink at the center, and this is one hemisphere, that's the other hemisphere, and each hemisphere has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. So the intermediate zone is what forms the spinocerebellum, while the flocculonodular lobe forms the vestibulocerebellum. The lateral zone of the hemispheres form the corticocerebellum that plan movement, execute movement. So corticocerebellum will plan movement, okay, and spinocerebellum will execute movement. Vestibulocerebellum is for balance, the flocculonodular lobe. So what are the functions of the cerebellum? The cerebellum controls movement. Cerebrocerebellum plans motor function. Spinocerebellum does the actual execution, while vestibulocerebellum executes motor activity in order to maintain balance and adjust body posture. The cerebellum also has a role in motor plasticity and learning, so you're able to modify motor responses or sequences to changes in the surrounding environment. So that aids in adaptation. The cerebellum helps with modification of stretch reflexes. So with repeated stretching of muscles, the stretch reflex response becomes diminished, and this is altered to meet the current environmental circumstances. The cerebellum helps with the regulation of autonomic activity through the hypothalamocerebellar and cerebellohypothalamic pathways. Remember, hypothalamus regulates autonomic activity and it has connections with the cerebellum. So what are the relations of the cerebellum? So this is the position of the cerebellum, and anterior to it, we can see you have the fourth ventricle, the pons, and the medulla. Posterior to the cerebellum is a squamous part of occipital bone. That's where the occipital bone is located. And superior to the cerebellum is a tentorium cerebelli that separates it from the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. What are the fissures of the cerebellum? We have a primary fissure, okay? We have a primary fissure that separates the anterior lobe from the posterior lobe. This is the primary fissure. Then we also have the posterolateral fissure that secludes the flocculonodular lobe. Okay, so it's around that region. And then we have the horizontal fissure at the lower portion. So we have primary fissure between anterior and posterior lobe, posterolateral fissure that secludes the flocculonodular lobe, and also we have the horizontal fissure. The cerebellum, just like the cerebrum, has the outer gray cortex and inner white matter, and gray cortex is the nuclei of neurons, while white matter are myelinated axons of neurons. So this is the gray matter, and this is the white matter. You can appreciate again the vermis at the center, and deep cerebellar nuclei within the white matter. Remember, nuclear collection of cell bodies, so you can appreciate some gray within the white matter. Those are the deep cerebellar nuclei. So the cerebellar cortex histologically has 3 layers. Okay, remember the cerebellum itself has a cortex, which is gray matter and white matter, and the cortex has 3 layers. The outer molecular layers, that is usually has basket cells and neuron and stellate cells. These are neurons, different neurons. So basket cells and stellate cells are in the molecular layer, so they are very sparse. You can appreciate the nuclei the way they are sparsely distributed. Then the granular layer looks like granules of sand. This contains granular cells and Golgi cells. These are other different types of neurons. Okay. Then in between molecular and granular layer, we have a Purkinje cell layer. Can you appreciate that? It's like a strip of one layer of cells. That's a Purkinje cell layer. It contains Purkinje cells, which are neurons that have a flask-shaped cell body, large cell body that is flask-shaped. So they send their dendrites towards the molecular layer and send their axons towards the granular layer. So the cerebellar cortex has 3 layers: outer molecular with basketed stellate cells, Purkinje cell layer, and inner granular with granular cells and Golgi cells. The cerebellum has 3 peduncles: superior peduncle that connects it to the midbrain, middle peduncle that connects it to the pons, and inferior peduncle that connects it to the medulla. So that's the superior peduncle, the midbrain, the middle connects it to the pons. Okay, this is pons, this is midbrain, and inferior connecting to the cerebellum. And this just shows you, I need you to pause here and appreciate the different pathways that are carried through the different cerebellar peduncles. So the superior peduncles contains most of the cerebellar afferents. So we have the dentatothalamic, dentatorubral, fastigioreticular, and fastigiovestibular. So pathways are named from origin to termination. And also we have an afferent to the cerebella, the ventral spinocerebellar, through the superior peduncle. The middle peduncle carries corticopontine fibers, corticopontocerebellar fibers, and this corticopontine and pontocerebellar pathways form corticopontocerebellar system that projects to the neocerebellum. Remember we said the neocerebellum has the cerebellar hemispheres. The inferior peduncle has 2 components: the restiform and juxtarestiform bodies. The restiform body contains fibers from dorsal and rostral spinocerebellar, cuniocerebellar, olivocerebellar, reticulocerebellar, and cerebelloreticular pathways, while just juxtarestiform bodies have vestibulocerebellar fibers and cerebrovestibular fibers. The blood supply to the cerebella is by different blood vessels. So we have superior cerebellar artery from basilar, anterior inferior cerebellar artery that's also from basilar, as well as posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So this diagram just shows you, this is the basilar artery, and you have the posterior inferior cerebellar coming from vertebral artery, that's anterior inferior cerebellar from basilar, and you have the superior cerebellar from basilar. Cerebellum has 4 nuclei. So we have fastigial, globose, emboliform, and dentate, and these nuclei are usually within the white matter of the cerebellum. So these are a collection of neuronal cell bodies within the white matter of the cerebellum. So you can appreciate here, you need to know the order because you'll be asked in an exam, practical exam, name the or show us the four nuclei of the cerebellum in order from medial to lateral. So you start with fastigial, then globus, emboliform, then dentate. So dentate is this one that is convoluted and it's the bigger one on the lateral aspect. So dentate, globus, emboliform, fastigial, that's lateral to medial. So you need to know the order. Then the cerebellar nuclei are a principal, they have principal source of efference from the cerebellum, and they usually project to the thalamus, vestibular nuclei, red nucleus, and other brainstem nuclei, while they receive information from collaterals from afferents to the cerebellar cortex, axons of Purkinje cells from the cerebellar cortex, and also vestibulocerebellar fibers from the vestibular labyrinth and nuclei. So again, this just shows you the connections of the cerebellum through superior peduncle to the midbrain, the middle peduncle to the pons, inferior peduncle to the medulla, and the different fibers that are carried. So you can see like this will be a dentatothalamic pathway from the dentate to the thalamus, okay? Fastigiothalamic, depending on where the fibers are carrying information from and going to. So the cerebellum is connected to other parts of the brain, and the afferent connection involve mossy fibers which carry all input to the cerebella except from inferior olivary nucleus. And mainly this mossy fiber system form the corticopontocerebellar system from the cerebral cortex to the pons to the cerebellum. Then we also have a climbing fiber system that contains axons in the contralateral inferior olivary nuclear complex. Then we have monoaminergic afferents to the cerebellum, and these are from the pontine raphe nuclei, which are serotonergic, locus coeruleus that are noradrenergic, and hypothalamus that use histamine as a neurotransmitter. So the efferents we have the Purkinje cells that send inhibitory GABAergic projections to the cerebellar nuclei, and through the cerebellar peduncles they get to other parts of the CNS. Some Purkinje cells in the vestibulocerebellar send axons directly to the vestibular nuclei via the juxtarestiform body, and this bypass the cerebellar nuclei. So next, we are going to discuss the lesions of the cerebella. They usually cause hypotonia, so you'll have diminished tendon reflexes, so the muscles will be weak and flabby. That's called asthenia. You can also have a synergia, where you lack coordinated movement. So we have what you call dysmetria, where distances are frequently improperly gauged. So we have what you call past pointing, when you ask somebody to point at the tip of their nose and also point at the tip of their finger, holding their finger in front of their eyes. So they may pass the finger or pass the nose. So that's what you call pass pointing. Then we have dysdiadochokinesia, which is a rapid successive movement. So you tell the patient to alternate supination and pronation of the hand, and they have to do it quickly. So usually if they have a cerebellar lesion, they'll be poor rapid successive movement. Lesions of the cerebella are also present with intentional tremors. Okay, when you ask somebody, please pass me that cup of tea, the moment they get the cup and start passing it to you, you see tremors on their hands. Those are intentional tremors, and they're different from basal ganglia tremors, where somebody is just seated and they have tremors at rest. Then we have ataxia, where there's distortion of voluntary muscles, so axial muscles of the shoulder and pelvic girdles are involved. Cerebellar lesions also cause nystagmus, where you have oscillatory movement of the eyeball, and also speech disturbance, where you have slurred speech. So we can ask you list 5 features of cerebellar lesions. So this should be able to tell me what is past pointing, what is dysdiadochokinesia, what is the difference between intentional tremors and tremors at rest, what is ataxia, what is nystagmus, and the slurred speech. So we are going to discuss cerebellar lesions in the subsequent brief lecture.